And I'm now starting a recording. So by attending this webinar, you are giving consent to this event being recorded. The reason being is that if someone couldn't attend today, they can still watch it back later, and you will also have a link to the recording later on if you want to see the talks again or look at what people asked in the Q&A session. So yes, we're recording this event. If you have any questions or technical issues, please email this email address I'm putting in the chat right now. That is mine. I work in the AuthorAID team at INES, so does Andy, who you can see on the screen. And yeah, today we will be having the webinar on critically reading a scientific paper, chaired by Alex, and I will hand over to her.
Thank you, Tabitha. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, according to your time zone. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on this webinar. Reading scientific papers is one of the most useful skills you can have as a researcher. And in my experience, it's not something that is taught actively. It is something that you learn by practice. So our webinar today has very important tools and tips to critically read scientific papers. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Farooq Rathore, and he is from Pakistan. He is a consultant and an associate professor in rehabilitation medicine at the Armed Forces Institute of Rehabilitation Medicine in I'm sorry, what?
I think that was accidental.
Okay, in Rawalpindi, Pakistan. He identifies himself as a rehabilitation physician, a teacher, a researcher, and a mentor. He has published over 180 national and international publications with more than 2,000 citations, and has been invited as a plenary speaker in national and international conferences, and chaired and co-chaired scientific sessions. He has won multiple national and international awards, travel grants, and scholarships. He is editorial board member of several journals, and the national representative of Pakistan for the International Society of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation and Asia Oceanian Society of PMR. He is also the executive board member of AOSPRM, of the Asia and Oceania Society of PMR, and advisory board member for Cochrane Rehabilitation. He is passionate about teaching research writing and has conducted more than 100 workshops on medical writing, scientific misconduct, research ethics, presentation skills, spasticity management, and stroke rehabilitation in 5 countries of the world. His areas of interest are spinal cord injuries, stroke rehabilitation, amputee management, disaster rehabilitation, medical education, and bioethics. Of course, you can find him on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, ResearchGate, among others. And right now, he's going to share his insights on critically reading a scientific paper. And if you have any questions, please write them down. And I think we'll cover the questions after the second talk. So thank you, Dr. Farooq Rathore, for being here, and the floor is yours.
I think Farooq might have actually lost connection. He dropped out. In the meantime, maybe we'll just introduce Yasaswi as well.
Let me unmute myself. Our second speaker is Dr. Yasaswi Walpita. She is a specialist in public health and a senior lecturer at the Department of Community Medicine of the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka. She has a master's and a doctoral degree in community medicine, and she's a keen researcher with a number of publications under her name. She is also a trainer in research methods at undergraduate and postgraduate medical disciplines in Sri Lanka, and also a trainer in global health at the University of Cardiff, Wales, in the UK. Yasaswi is a coordinator of Research Support Program, Research Promotion and Facilitation Center, Faculty of Medicine, Colombo, and she's heavily engaged in promoting journal clubs to facilitate training of critiquing scientific literature. So as you can see, our speakers are perfect for this topic. And I'm sure you, as well as I, am looking forward to the insights that they have to share.
Farooq is still trying to connect, so I think we're going to have to switch around the agenda and start with Yasasi. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Yasasi.
Right. Thank you, Alex, for that kind introduction. Very good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on your time zones. I think Farooq is back. Alex, do you want to switch off presentations because that might retain the flow?
I'm sorry, Yasasi, can you repeat that?
I think Farooq is back on meeting, Alex. Maybe we can start with his presentation. That is, or should I go ahead?
If you're ready, I think you can go ahead, please.
Right. Okay. Right. Let me share my slides. Right. Again, we have a lot of participants today, and it's encouraging to see this interest in scientific writing and critical appraisal. Today, my topic is based on the tools, the standard tools that we use for the process of critical appraisal. I'm sure the next speaker, Farooq, will show you in a clear and a simple manner as to how we carry out this process. So my presentation is a complementary presentation to Farooq's, which will tell you or elaborate more on the standard tools that we use for critical appraisal. Now, as we all know, critical appraisal is a systematic assessment of a piece of evidence that we have in hand in order to the validity. We may do this appraisal for different purposes. Our objective may be to use the evidence for practice, say for example, to generate some guidelines, or to see whether treatment is good enough or to be used in practice, or else our objective may be to collate different pieces of evidences that we have in hand and to improve the strength of evidence by doing a systematic review or a meta-analysis or some form of a narrative review. So whatever the purpose is, objective is, having a standard tool for this purpose allows us to do this by so in other words, that lets us doing this appraisal in a systematic manner by ourselves. So these tools will let you ask the right question at the right time by guiding you through an article in a very methodical manner, starting from the research question up until the reference list of an article. It will guide you through in a systematic manner. Now, generally, these tools have a set of questions to assess the internal validity, that is, the level of bias in a study. And in addition to that, most of these tools include questions to address the external validity or the generalizability of a study. Now, those of you who are familiar with the critical appraisal process may know that some tools, say for example, the tools developed by the Cochrane collaboration, they do a detailed internal validity assessment via their tools, which is also referred to as risk of bias assessment. And they consider that to be the key concept when assessing whether a study is valid. So therefore, Such tools, they give a lot of emphasis on the different domains of biases. In their tools, they have a set of questions to assess the different biases and see whether the study has taken adequate steps to get rid of those biases or have taken adequate measures to minimize the biases. So they may have questions to see whether there is biases due to confounding, whether there is a selection bias, compliance with the interventions, and also any misclassifications or missing data, biases due to missing data, and biases in measuring the outcomes, or even bias to selective reporting. Different questions incorporated. This question is, now who develops these tools for appraisal? If they are so-called standard tools, then we should be able to identify the bodies who are involved in development of this appraisal checklist. Now, few such organizations can be identified. If you Google search, for example, one such center is the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, the Oxford University-based center, who have developed tools for critical appraisal of systematic reviews, diagnostic studies, prognostic studies, and even for randomized controlled trials. Another popular organization is the CAS program, which is the Critical Appraisal Skills Program. And their checklists are simple and very reader-friendly, mainly utilized for the general reading purposes, while appraisal to mention is the Chanabricks critical appraisal tools, which is an Australian-based global organization, supports evidence-based practice. So again, they have a number of checklists to appraise critically. And a Cochrane collaboration is another well-known organization involved in the development of critical appraisal tools. So as you can see here, there are a number of organizations and interested parties who have gone on to develop the checklists for critical appraisal or the tools for critical appraisal. Therefore, the next question is how to select a tool for the appraisal of evidence that you have in hand. So there are a few steps that we need to follow in this process. The first and the most important thing is to see what is the clinical or the review question that the article or that study is trying to address. So we follow this so-called PICO approach to do this, where we look at the population that is that the study is trying to address, and also the interventions or the exposure that the study is looking at, and whether or not there are comparison groups, and also what are the outcomes that the study is trying to look at. So by following the PICO process or looking at the PICO components, what we are trying to achieve is to identify the study design or the type of study that the article is talking about. Now, sometimes this might be a straightforward process and the design is very obvious, but sometimes it might not be the case. Why? Now, increasingly we see there are a lot of mixed method studies and the studies based on large cohorts or databases with the digital developments. So sometimes this is not very straightforward to identify the study design. So in such scenarios, the best practice is that we adhere to a protocol, which is there, which helps us to identify the study design following a systematic pathway. So there are a number of protocols that helps you to identify the study design. Now, why is this important in selecting an appraisal tool? Now, one reason is that after identifying the study design, sometimes you might decide to continue with your critical appraisal, and sometimes you may even decide to drop appraising that article any further. Now, why that is so? Now, you may have heard about this hierarchy of evidence, where certain study designs like randomized control trials are at the top of the hierarchy in terms of the quality of evidence. And say, for example, the cross-sectional studies are at a lower level in the hierarchy. So higher the level of hierarchy, the higher the quality of evidence and lower the risk of bias. And in development of certain guidelines, etc., some organizations are interested only of the higher level evidence, only of the randomized control trials, or maybe the cohort studies. So if that is the case, then there is no point further appraising an article of lower quality. So it all depends on the objective of appraisal, right? So identifying the study design is important to take this decision whether to go forward appraising your evidence or whether to drop it at that point. So if you decide to go forward with your appraisal process, then is the time for you to identify your tool based on your study design. There are different critical appraisal tools used for different study designs. Now, if I start with the top of the hierarchy study design, that is systematic reviews. Now we can see a number of tools. Now this is only a few commonly used ones that I have mentioned in the slides. Number of tools are there, starting from the ROBIS tool, which is developed by the University of Bristol, MSTAR, a CAS checklist is there, so number of tools for systematic reviews. Similarly, if you look at randomized control trials, you again have several tools. One commonly used one is a Cochrane risk of bias tool, the ROB version, CAS checklist, Jana Briggs have a checklist, NHLBI, so like number of tools again. Non-randomized control trials also, you have one from Cochrane collaboration, the Robbins one, and you have one from Jana Briggs, and one from the Steward checklists, that is from University of Cardiff, right? There are a number of tools. So not only for that, there are different tools and a number of tools for observational studies as well. Again, like the observational studies, you know that we can categorize as cohort studies, case control studies, or cross-sectional studies. So depending on these subtypes also, we have different tools. Now, some tools like Robbins one or the Newcastle-Ottawa scale, they have their versions for cohort and case control studies, both. So not only for this conventional study designs, but we also have other study tools for qualitative studies. We have one from CASP, we have one from JBI, because this is a common question that the researchers who are involved in non-conventional studies, they ask whether there are tools for non-conventional studies. Now, if you are involved in say like appraising an article on an economic evaluation, or maybe a prognostic study or a predictive study, still you have specific tools, which I have not listed here. Otherwise, it will be an exhaustive list. But of course, if you Google search, you will find number of tools specifically designed for those types of studies as well, right? So now you can see now there are number of tools. So we could be immersed in a pool of tools when it comes to critical appraisal. So it is very important that we look at our objectives and also the other requirements that we have in hand when we are appraising an article. Now, for example, now if we are appraising an article for the development of a clinical guideline, now let's take, for example, the NICE guideline development. Now, the NICE guideline development committee, they have some preferred checklists that they use for critical appraisal. So if you're doing it for that purpose, then you will have to use one of the recommended critical appraisal checklist. Now, what I have displayed here, systematic to review, they want you to use the raw-based critical appraisal. So as you can see, it is not only the study design that determines the type of tool that you use, but there are other considerations as well for what you use this tool for. Now, why this? Now, say for example, the NICE Guideline Committee have their preferences in deciding a tool for critical appraisal, is that increasingly now, when the evidence is converted into practice, or when the evidence is converted into recommendations, the scientific world is using a systematic approach. Now, some of you may have heard about this grade approach. Now, even the NICE Guideline Committee, they follow this grade approach, where they're trying to grade the quality of literature that you use. So by using the grade approach, you can categorize the quality of evidence or the article that you have in hand as of high quality, moderate quality, low quality, or not use that evidence. So in this process, the critical appraisal tools play an important role. So in summary, what I want to emphasize is on number of reasons. So it could be the need for, as I have mentioned at the upfront, it may depend on the study question, the study design, or maybe the other requirements that you have in hand, as that I have just mentioned. Whether if you're doing it for a guideline development, then of course you have to use the recommended tool. So a webinar of this nature, we don't have enough time really elaborate on individual tool in this. So is to show you the pathway of selecting, or at least most of these tools are freely available online, along with the training manuals, guidelines, and the scoring systems for easy application. So you just have to be aware in selecting a tool, then you have enough tools in for you to adopt and use for your appraisal process. So that concludes my presentation, and I want to address those at the end of next presentation. So thank you very much, and over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Yasaswi, for your very interesting question. Those were a lot of tools, and at some point, I would like to ask you, if you were to choose three, like your three basic assessment tools, which one would you suggest?
On the study design. It depends on the study design. So if you want to assess a systematic review, I would go for raw-based. I would go for the raw-based tool. And if you want to assess a randomized controlled trials, my choice would be the ROB tool, again the Cochrane tool. And if I want to assess an observational study, for the general assessment, if it is not for a systematic review, I would like to go for a Newcastle-Ottawa scale, because it gives a broader appraisal of the quality of evidence, considering both the internal and external validity. But if I'm doing my appraisal for a systematic review, then I would go for Robbins one tool.
Okay, thank you very much. There are some questions in the chat. We are going to cover them at the end of the second session, or the second after the second speaker. There will be a time for questions, so thank you for your patience. And thank you, Dr. Walpita, for your excellent presentation. And we are moving on to Dr. Farooq Rathore's presentation. We already introduced him. He is a rehabilitation physician who specializes in spinal cord injuries, stroke recovery, and disaster recovery, which sounds super interesting, and I would like to hear more about that some other time. Thank you, Dr. Farooq Rathore.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you please confirm that you can hear my voice and see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, my sincere apologies for the mishap. It was a technical glitch, and at least those who are from Pakistan can very well understand how life can be unpredictable once you have, like a power failure at the last moment and your internet goes off. So I apologize again. And in case if my internet connection is unstable, please let me know, and I'll sort of like go on to my third backup plan. So what I'm going to do, this was supposed to be the first presentation, and I was supposed to give you an overview of the basics on how to critically read or appraise a scientific paper. Since my background is I'm a physician, I'm a doctor. So primarily this is going to be sort of like related to medical articles, but I'm pretty sure that my colleagues in social sciences and other healthcare related subjects are going to find it interesting, and they're going to get some kind of guidance that is going to make their journey of critically reading and appraising a scientific paper easy. The first question that we need to ask is that why there's a need for critically reading a scientific paper. Like, I mean, a paper is in front of me. Should I read it or not? What's the big deal? So I would like to take you to this fact that there's an increasing number of scientific articles, and there has been an exponential increase in the number of articles that are being published each day. And the time is limited for each one of us. For example, if you talk of healthcare sciences, one of the most commonly utilized website is PubMed or Medline. So as of today, the PubMed has more than 34 million citations for biomedical literature. Just let's assume for the sake of discussion that out of these 34 million, only 10%, that is 3.4 million articles are relevant to me and you. So if we were to read 931 articles each day for next 10 years, only then we are going to cover these 3.4 million articles. And I'm pretty sure by the time we cover these articles, many more million articles would have been published. Therefore, we need to understand what we need to read and what we do not need to read. Then you need to ask this question: what do I need to study, and how do I study, where I have to give time to my family, to my patient, to my own professional development. In addition, I have to read a lot. And whenever I read an article, what I need to believe and what do I disregard? Because we know that in the recent past, even many influential articles have been retracted from high impact journals. So just because an article is published in a scientific journal does not mean that you and me are supposed to believe and follow it blindly. We need to be very critical and appraise that article. And probably the most important question for people like you and me working in developing countries with a very poor healthcare system and less resources is that even if I read this hi-fi article with a great technological advance in the West, let's say in the Europe or Northern America, is this article relevant to my patient that I see on a daily basis in my clinic? Is this treatment feasible? What about this prognosis that they talk of? And if the cost evaluation is workable in my country where the healthcare system is not prioritized? So these are the questions that actually ask you to have a critical look whenever you read a scientific article. And as David Sackett, the father of modern evidence-based medicine, once said, half of what you learn in medical school will shown to be either dead wrong or out of date within 5 years of your graduation. And I would rather say it's like 1 or 2 years considering 2022. The trouble is that nobody can tell you which half. So the most important thing to learn is how to learn on your own and to develop that critical eye that allows you to pick out the gems from this vast sea of literature that is expanding on a daily basis. So what is this critical appraisal or critical reading of article? The definition is it is a systematic process. And I'm glad that my other speaker has given you a really good list of some tools and checklist that is going to make this systematic approach easier for you. So this process is used to identify the strength and weaknesses of a research article in order to assess the usefulness, as I just mentioned, and validity of the research finding in order to apply them to your own patient and your own healthcare system. But at the same time, we need to understand that this critical reading or critical appraisal is not a negative dismissal of any piece of research. You don't go out with a negative mindset. You go out with a positive mindset so that you can actually realize what is true and what is not. And you cannot do a critical reading based on the results alone. You have to go through whole of the article based on a systematic approach that I'm going to describe in detail a bit later on. And it is not only based on the statistical analysis alone. So this is something that, actually bothers many people, many youngsters who are not very good in statistics. And they say, since, I don't have a very good grasp on mathematics and statistics, and since I cannot understand these statistical tools and tests used in this research article, so probably I cannot make a decision whether this is like a good piece of research or not. So you need to understand that statistical analysis, while is a very important component of the in-depth critical appraisal or critical reading of a scientific article, it is not the only tool on which you are going to base your assessment. It is not something that has to be performed only by an expert. So it is not something that has to be performed only by a senior professor or your head of department or someone who has spent many decades in that particular field. No, even a young student who has a critical eye, who has these kind of tools and skills set with him or her, can perform this critical reading of article, and he or she can identify the right from the wrong. So what would be the advantages if you develop this reading, this habit of critically appraising and reading scientific literature whenever you go through reading an article? First of all, you will be able to find high quality information that is relevant to your own need and the need of the patient that you see in your own country, in your healthcare system. And you will be able to differentiate between statistical significance and clinical significance. It is a very important concept, and because of paucity of time, I'm not going to go in detail, but you need to understand, many a time people get, impressed by the use of word p-value less than 0.005 or 0.001. And this result was statistically significant. The question is whether it is statistically significant on a piece of paper or is it clinically significant in my clinical practice. You need to understand the differentiation between two. It also leads to a habit, what we call a speed reading, which means that every one of us has limited time and we have to read a large amount of literature. If we develop this kind of critical eye and a critical appraisal and a critical skill to read through scientific literature, we will be first of all able to identify high quality article and then quickly skim through them and make a decision whether it is worth spending more time on this particular article or not. This is called speed reading. And obviously, once you have a critical eye, you can identify high quality relevant information. This means that your quality of patient care is going to be based on the principles of evidence-based medicine and definitely would be better and as per the scientific norms. And I personally feel if you develop this habit of critically reading and appraising a scientific article, ultimately it would help you become a better writer and a better peer reviewer. Why? Because at this time, you are trying to identify the hidden gems and you are trying to see and seek the truth. At other time, you are going to be a writer. If you know that once you were a reader, what you were looking for. So as a writer, you are going to write those things that a reader looks for. So it will help you become a better writer and peer reviewer. So coming to the actual part, that how to critically read a research paper. And specifically, I'm talking about a medical research paper, but it can be applied to other scientific fields as well. You need to understand this. The simple things matter most. So these are the 3 steps that I would like to propose in critical appraisal or reading of a scientific article. The first is you need to ask some basic questions. You need to do a general appraisal, and then you need to do a detailed appraisal. The general points are, number 1, since many of us, they don't have English as their first language, mother language. So sometimes, people like us, they tend to get impressed with these articles written in hi-fi, what we call a hi-fi English. Do not get impressed by scientific jargon and a complex use of language, because it has been proven that good articles are written in plain language so that most of the scientists, researchers, readers can understand them. And, even in today's world, even patients who are not physician or doctor or scientists, they also read these scientific articles in order to make informed decisions. So a good article is usually written in plain English. Number 2, even authoritative and high impact journals can have bad articles and vice versa. And we know from our experience of COVID-19. So no one knew what COVID-19 is all about. Hundreds and thousands of articles are published within a very short span. And hundreds of articles, even from influential journals like Lancet and BMJ, were retracted, which meant either they were fraudulent, they were not conducted according to the scientific norms and protocols. So just because an article is published in an international biomedical journal does not mean you and me have to believe in that article blindly. We still have to apply the principles of critical appraisal. Your focus mainly should on the research question itself, because a good research article is based on a good research question. If a research question is vague, it is not smart, it is not focused, probably the article written on the basis of that poor research question is not going to be a high quality article. Then you have to see and focus on the study design as well, because a good research article always focuses on an appropriate study design. And then you have to focus on the outcome as well. Yes, I again say statistics is an absolutely important part of the detailed appraisal, but you don't need to only focus on the statistics part. You can actually have other tools which can help you do appraisal in a much better way. And always be critical. At the end of reading that article, always ask this question: does it make sense to my practice, to my patient, to my healthcare system? Now, coming to the basic question, the first basic question that you need to ask is the journal peer reviewed? I'm sure you know what a peer-reviewed journal is. So a peer-reviewed journal is a journal which has a formal system of evaluation of articles submitted to that journal by different experts, which means that they have already evaluated those articles that are published, they have filtered them, and it has gone through a systematic process where some expert see and evaluate whether this article is of high quality or not. That's the first thing you need to understand and see whether the journal is peer-reviewed or not. Then the second question you might want to ask is the journal reputable, and is it associated with a scientific organization? Usually good journals are associated with international organization and international scientific committees. So, and which means that many people from those international organization and scientific committees actually take a responsibility or are part of the editorial board member, and they make sure only high quality articles are published in that particular journal. Then yes, this is not on the only parameter, but we know many universities around the globe still believe in this impact factor. And in order to get the impact factor, a journal has to strive a lot, which means that, like a general principle, high impact journals are the one which are long-term journals, which are in the market for many decades to even more than a century, and they have a very rigorous evaluation and peer review process. So if a journal has an impact factor of, let's assume you have very limited time only to read 3 articles in the next 2 days. So probably if you ask me, you should be reading an article published in an impact factor having a higher impact factor rather than a journal with no impact factor or a very low impact factor. You have to prioritize your time, right? And do your colleague, your senior, your expert, your supervisor, your teacher, they often quote this journal. Because if they often quote this journal, probably this journal is of high value, and this journal is more relevant to the work that you are doing, and probably you are also going to quote a lot of things from this particular journal. Coming to the base, from basic, then you move on to the specific things, and you can actually go through the article, like stepwise approach, and you can make your decision whether to go forward or not. So for example, coming to the title and abstract. So does the title convey useful information? For example, most of the guidelines recommend that in case of a randomized control trial, it has to be clearly mentioned that this is a randomized control trial right in the title. If a title does not mention that, probably this is not a high quality good title, and you can assume that probably the article is not going to be high quality as well. And then you identify important information and main finding by just reading the abstract. You need to understand, the abstract is the summary of the whole. And this summary has to be high quality because it is the front page or front cover of the whole product. So if someone has not spent enough time in order to write a very good abstract, probably they haven't spent enough time to write a good article as well. Then if the keyword that are used by the journal or by the article are the same keyword that you are using in your own research, probably it's a good match and you should be reading that particular article. Coming to the introduction part. First of all, the introduction of any good article should end with the aims, objective, or research question of the main study. So if the main research question of the article is very similar to the question that you are seeking yourself and you're asking for, probably it's a very good fit and you should be reading this particular article. Since we just mentioned that, medical, all kinds of sciences, including medical science, are rapidly evolving. So things get outdated within weeks to months. So if an article is too old, probably there's not much need of reading that article unless it is a seminal article. And a seminal article is the one which has strongly influenced later development. And one of
I think we're experiencing some technical issues. Please be patient. Thank you.
I think Farooq lost connection. I've contacted him already, but it looked like he was getting to the end of his presentation. To those asking on the screen, it's not your connection, it's Dr. Farooq has lost connection. We're very sorry. Oh, here he is.
sorry, yeah, I'm back. Sorry, I'm really sorry, really sorry.
No problem.
Okay, coming back. Again, can you please confirm that you can hear my voice and see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. Thank you. So I stopped here. So the introduction, the last part is that are the aims and objective of the article clearly stated, because it would indicate that the author has actually clearly stated what are their aims and objective. Coming to the material and method, first of all, the most important thing that you need to understand is in today's world, are ethical concerns appropriately addressed, and is there an official institutional review board or ethical review committee approval available or not? You need to understand it doesn't matter how good the article is. If there are any ethical concerns, that article is not worth reading, or those findings are not worth integrating in your own clinical practice. You need to understand that. Ethics is the basis of everything. It's based on, and is the study design valid for your question? For example, you are looking for a randomized control trial. So probably if you are reading an article based on a retrospective chart analysis of data, probably it is not a good match, and you should be focusing on some other article. Then each research article, specifically biomedical article, should have a very clearly stated inclusion and exclusion criteria, on which basis you are including certain patients and on what basis you are excluding certain patients. It would give you an idea whether your patient that you see in your own practice are actually being addressed in this particular article or not. And then are those method, equipment used or narrated in the article relevant to your own patient population? And is the treatment feasible in your own setting? I'll quickly give you an example. We all know that, like because of a rapid spread of internet, everyone can go online and see what are the latest advancement in medical sciences. But not all those advances are available in your own setting. People come to my clinic and they ask about like robotics. So again, I totally believe in robotics, but probably robotics is not something that is easily available in most of the developing countries. So instead of focusing or reading many articles on robotics, I would rather be reading more articles which are more relevant to the practice that I see on a daily basis. And again, my colleague talked about in detail regarding the issue of bias. And it's important, at least in randomized control trial, that there should be a conscious effort on the part of researcher in order to limit bias while selecting the patient and dividing them to different groups. Other thing is that you need to understand that how are other protocol explain like blinding and others, the outcome of the study, and the author has to clearly mention all these things in their material and method section. And there are many outcomes that are used in different conditions, but not every outcome is going to be. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Oh, sorry, yeah. So sometimes the outcome that are mentioned in the material method are not very relevant to the outcome that you're seeking. So it's important that you focus on those articles which discuss the outcome that you are seeking yourself. And the most important in medical sciences is the follow-up long enough to be meaningful. Many research articles, specifically in biomedical field, they would mention a follow-up of, let's say, 2 months, 4 months, and a year. But many chronic diseases, they actually go on for years and years. So you need to understand whether the follow-up is long enough to be meaningful. Coming to the results, demographics should be clearly mentioned, and the baseline demographic between different groups must be similar because it reduces bias and comparison between two different groups. And then you need to understand that if your patient is so different from those in the study, then the result might not be applicable to the population that you are seeing. Then you have to see that whether the statistical tests that are applied are appropriate for the study design and clinical question that was asked in the introduction and material and method section. Then again, this is the difference between the statistical significance that has to be done by statistical analysis. And then sometime, if you're an expert in statistics, you can actually identify that there's an issue of statistical phishing, that people change statistical test and analysis in order to ensure statistical significance. I agree that this is something that not everyone can do, but if you're an expert in biostatistics, probably this is something that you need to understand and you might want to do whenever it comes to critical reading of paper. Then many journal would demand that you have to mention the reporting guides clearly. And there is a website known as Equator Network, which clearly mentions all the reporting guides for different study designs. You can go online and you can download those guidelines and apply while critically reading your article. Coming to the discussion section, you have to see whether the important results of the study are summarized in the first paragraph, and do the author attempt to compare and contrast their finding with both the local and global finding. This is a major issue with articles being published from developing countries, that people would only focus on articles which are published on the developed world, Europe and Northern America and Japan and Australia. No, if you're working in a developing country in, let's say, Southeast Asia and Africa, you need to compare and contrast your own result with the data which is available from your own area and from your own country. And do the author acknowledge limitation, because if some author acknowledge limitation, it means they have insight into the limitations of their own study. And this is actually considered to be a strength of the writing part. And if there's any conflict of interest, it must be clearly mentioned. If you are an expert and you have an in-depth knowledge of statistics, you might want to go for the detailed appraisal analysis, and it would then include making sense of the p-value, confidence intervals, relative risk reduction, and absolute risk reduction. And then you also have to see whether the sample size estimation is appropriate or not. So the summary is that there are millions of articles that are published each year, and each one of us, because of our personal and professional commitment, has a limited time and increasing responsibility. A critical reading of the literature would actually is an important part of the evidence-based medicine, which is helpful in improving the healthcare for the patient. And it is a useful skill that can be learned and then mastered. And it does not always require an in-depth knowledge of statistics. So even if you are a young student and if you have that critical eye, you can critically read a paper and take out the right thing from the right idea, and then you can apply that in your own clinical practice. It is not what you look at that matters, it is what you see. So we all read a lot of articles, maybe on a weekly basis, but very few of us have that critical eye which allow us to identify high quality relevant information. I really hope that this presentation would help you at least the basics, and you will be able to identify high quality relevant information for your own patients. Thank you very much. This is my email. If you want a copy of the presentation, feel free to email me. And I apologize again for the technical glitches that were actually beyond my control. So back to the webinar chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rathore, for the wonderful presentation. And I'm sure everyone will find these tips very, very useful. Now we have time for a couple questions. I have one question from the chat that was published by Dr. Salisu, and it's for Dr. Jasazwi. And it says, do we assume that the selection tools is flexible, that the selection of tools is flexible? There is no rigidity in the choice of tools. So she's wondering whether the tools for assessment are flexible. Dr. Jasazwi.
Thank you, Alex. Yes, of course, my answer would be yes, it is flexible. It depends on your requirements, as I have repeatedly mentioned in my presentation. If your requirement assessment is just to read and appraise an article for day-to-day practice, as my colleague just mentioned. It's always good to use a simple checklist based on your level of understanding and all that. So you can simply use a checklist developed by CASP. But if you're doing this for a more scholarly work, like for a systematic review or a meta-analysis, you have to use a recommended tool by the particular organization. So it's always flexible, but with caution, depending on your objective. So if your organization demands, if the work that you do demands a certain tool to be used, then of course, then it becomes not flexible, but you have to use what is demanded for. I think I have answered that question, Alex.
Yes, thank you very much. We have another question from the chat. This one was by Madhuri Kumari, and they're wondering how to achieve speed reading of how to achieve speed reading of article with critical eyes, and whether Dr. Rathore can give some tips for speed reading.
Yeah, so thank you very much. First of all, we need to understand that reading, like any other thing, is a skill. So just go back the first time you read a scientific article. It might have appeared very difficult for you. You might have maybe spent like more than an hour on understanding what does this mean. But the more articles you read, it becomes easier for you. So the first thing is it is a skill, and a skill can be mastered if you do a certain activity again and again. So, you know, like you might want to like use the simplified checklist I used, and then the in-depth checklist that my colleague suggested, and you start critically appraising article as a group, first of all, so that if someone misses one thing, the other person can point it out. And if you do it for a couple of times, I can tell you it's just like learning how to drive. So one day you'll be confident enough that you can actually read through an article in a half-an-hour time, and you would be able to identify the high quality relevant information that you can actually use in your own clinical practice. So it's a skill. Do it again and again with a systematic approach, and you will achieve your objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a poll from this webinar. If you please go to the chat and open the link that Tabitha has shared, because we have a poll that we'd like you to fill. Now, if you allow me, Doctors Rawalpindi and Rathore, when I teach this subject to my students, I will usually mention, like, don't worry if you don't know all the procedures or all the methods that are being used, or if there are some words that you're not familiar with, write them down, find the definitions later, and just focus on finding the objective of the paper and the gist of the paper and the main conclusion. And I think you're halfway there. Oh, we have another question, which is one of my favorite questions ever. Is by Chigozie Anacor, and it says, please, can reading an abstract alone be enough to cite that work in my research? This one is a hot topic, so either Rawalpindi or Dr. Rathore or Farooq, sorry, what Jasazwi or Farooq can answer that?
Yes, from my end, then again, it depends on the time that you have and that you do it. We always like to, depending on the time limitations, to go by the abstract. Not only the time limitations, sometimes we have the access limitations as well, especially from my region of practice, like Asian region. However, now there are certain components of quality of a study that we cannot really extract from an abstract. So it's always advisable, especially if you want to apply the findings of the study to your patients' clinical practice.
Okay, thank you. We have other questions, like how do we find articles from high impact journals, or how do I select the appropriate articles to build the basis for my literature review? These are from two different people. And how do I select mostly how to find literature and how to find papers.
Should I answer?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, so the answer to the first question, how do I find good research article? You have to wait a couple of weeks because one of the future webinars by AuthorAID is actually on how to do literature search, good literature search. So that webinar is going to actually give you some tools how to do good literature search and identify high quality articles. And what was the second part of the question? Can you tell me that again, please?
Oh, excuse me. It's a different question. How do I select the appropriate articles to build basis for my literature review, especially for an observational clinical trial?
Yeah, so again, the question is the same, that you select only high quality relevant article for anything, and which means that once you do a good literature search and you download or select, let's say 10, 20 or 30 different articles, now it depends that which of those articles you're going to read in detail and then paraphrase and then cite and quote. So probably if you follow the advice that was given by myself and my colleagues, you are going to find the relevant article for anything. It could be a literature search for a thesis. It could be a literature search for a presentation. It could be a literature search in order to make a lecture program. It could be a literature search in order to make a presentation like this. So again, the principle remains the same. It doesn't matter for which purpose you are going to use that article. The important thing is to critically develop that skill that would allow you to identify a highly relevant article to your own need. And that need could be anything. So again, I would say go back to the list that me and my colleagues shared, follow the advice, and you're going to get good articles and relevant articles.
Okay, thank you. I think we're reaching the end of our webinar. So I thank everyone who joined us today, and especially I thank Dr. Rawalpindi and Dr. Rathore for their very useful and very interesting tips and tools for research assessment. And I see a lot of questions and comments on the chat that asking about ethical issues and conflict of interest and literature search. So I will pass these comments along to my colleagues because I see another webinar in our futures. So thank you everyone for joining us. Please don't forget to fill the poll that Tabitha has posted on the chat. And hopefully we'll see you soon in our next webinar. And please follow us on social media so you can stay abreast of all the information and all the news from AuthorAID. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.